Welcome to Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, a new Procurious podcast series. Hi there, I'm Philip Eidson, the host of Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, a 5-part procurement podcast series sponsored by IBM. And there's many factors that require careful consideration to bring about effective cognitive solutions. It's really akin to conducting a group of musicians. It may be possible, even easy, to attain a pleasant sound from a solo instrument. But when expertly managed, you can accomplish a symphony from an entire orchestra. And this week, Procurious and IBM are taking you through the 5 steps to conducting a dazzling cognitive symphony, from building your orchestra to getting the brass on board and orchestrating your melody. On day 4, getting the brass on board, I'm joined by Marco Romano, Procurement Chief Analytics Officer at IBM. And today I wanted to focus on the human element. I think that everybody listening today will recognize the importance of change management. And so in my first question, I asked Marco if he could share some of the common pitfalls that he sees leadership teams experience that impede adoption.
I would characterize the most common pitfalls into three areas. First being poor measurement systems placed around the analytics and cognitive solutions. Now, some will argue that you get what you measure, and that's absolutely true. But also true is that you get some unintended behaviors that will result if you measure the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. Now, that couldn't be more true in this analytics and cognitive space, and our experience certainly has been that I've seen poor measurements driving really, really poor behaviors time and time again, and in fact elevating levels of resistance to change because of poor metrics that have been applied. Second major pitfall is around poor messaging on why you want to implement these tools and what the desired outcome is, which in turn, again, creates fear and resistance to adoption and change. And then the third one, which is so often overlooked, is the lack of education and training to transition existing teams from what I'll term, the legacy way of working to, working in this new environment, making use of all of these, insights that we're getting from data. And again, I think that creates uncertainty and fear, but also it suboptimizes the potential benefits that we could get from these solutions if, the folks in the community are better able to make use of the insights and the capabilities.
Right. So I actually had a couple of questions. So I go back to the beginning. You talked about measurement systems and measuring the wrong thing, driving the outcomes that we don't want to see. I wonder, from your experience, what you think procurement leaders should be measuring?
I tell you, I'll start with an example of metric that I think shouldn't be measured, or one that is less important, and that is spend coverage. I hear it so often. I hear, how much spend have you got covered by analytics, or, how many price points worth of market intelligence do you have? And when I hear questions like that, both somewhat meaningless, right? If the adoption of the tools or the effectiveness of the data being presented is poor and cannot drive business value. To me, meaningful measure has to start with assessing and growing a behavior around your data quality. And I think, Philip, you've heard me say this now a few times. It really starts with data quality. So one, I think, of your key metrics has to be, around data quality. What that looks like, I think, ultimately depends on your desired business outcome, but also it really depends on where you are on that maturity curve, right, in terms of your data and data quality. As far as metrics around the actual analytics and cognitive solutions, I think it's impossible for procurement to escape measuring hard savings against cost of goods and services purchased, right? I think that'll always be a factor, and I think we should have that. But again, I would argue, is it really incremental savings that we're trying to target as a result of these tools? Or are we trying to help our practitioners arrive at those savings faster and smarter? And I think how we apply that metric certainly drives behaviors. My experience has been when you challenge a practitioner and say, hey, you've got an additional 10, 20% because now I've given you a smart tool. It really drives a lot of resistance to change and a lot of excuses, right, as to why the tools cannot or shouldn't be used. I would strongly also push for metrics around adoption and behavior change. Examples can be, have we improved the throughput of the team, or improved speed to market, execution of transactions, and also very importantly, why do we want these tools? I want to be able to influence where and what people within our organization are spending money on, and I want to do that before they effect the transaction.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it after the fact, which is historically what we've done, right? We go and we slap people on the wrist and say, you could have done something different. Well, I want to preempt that action, right? So again, I think that's really what we ought to try and measure, how effective we are at changing those behaviors.
Right.
Tying it
to
I'm giving you
outcomes.
Absolutely. And then, I'm giving you a long-winded answer here, but there's one further one which I think is absolutely critical, and that is measuring a practitioner's satisfaction in the tool. I so seldom hear people say this, but why am I building these tools?
Yeah.
I'm building these tools to make my practitioners more successful and more efficient, right? So, to me, applied correctly, these measures will lead to the hard savings of operational efficiencies because you have adoption and actions resulting from these insights without having to force people down the path. So I really think it's about driving that mindset, right, about adoption and behavior.
You mentioned adoption and measuring the what the users essentially think of the tools that they're working with. It's so important, but like you say, so often forgotten about. Not just in this kind of tool, but any procurement tool. We typically focus on how it does what it does, but we don't focus on how easy it is to do what it does. And adoption essentially is everything. We can invest in the best tools that are out there, but if nobody uses them, they're still not bringing the value that we bought or that we wanted to see. I just had one more question on measurement systems, and you said right at the beginning about data quality. I just wondered how you can measure data quality, or what's some of the things you look for when you measure data quality as a metric?
No simple answer here, because it really depends on the quality metric that you're trying to achieve. And I know, Philip, it sounds like I've dodged the question, but it's somewhat difficult to answer without deep understanding of the environment. I do. Let me answer it this way. I think whatever metric you put in place, eventually that metric itself is going to need to be transformed into, something that is that drives an action, right? That drives value. So, to me, I think around data quality, it's things like if you're driving for taxonomy, it's not just how many points of spend have taxonomy associated with them, but it's the quality and consistency of the taxonomy that's applied. If you're talking ontology within data sets, again, it's the same thing. You can have 100% coverage in these things, but really how effective is it at helping you, determine the product or service that you're purchasing? So, that's why I say it's a difficult one to answer, because I think for each, whether it's hardware, services, and even within those, the subcategories, there would be different quality elements that I would look for. And my advice on this would also be one further thing. I would say, don't try and measure every sort of dimension of quality, because it becomes a such a big animal that you put people off. I think you really want to identify the 3, 4, 5 maybe key elements of quality that are absolutely going to give you what you need, that sort of 80-20 rule, and that's where I would focus my efforts.
So I want to touch on the fear factor you mentioned, and I completely resonate. And I think for most it's a pretty rational response when you're looking at something that's new, maybe bringing information and insights that haven't been available before, doing it faster. It leads people to question, one, is it a challenge to what I've done before and the accuracy of what I've done before, but also, is this technology going to leave what I do redundant? So there's a few dimensions to it. I wonder, as you see organizations start to go down this path, how are they overcoming the fear factor that exists?
Yeah, I think that stems from why you're wanting to implement these analytics and cognitive solutions and how you portray that. You're absolutely right. Fear is something that we see. CPOs are constantly talking about, robotics, automation, right? And very often I hear, headcount being brought into the discussion, right? Headcount reduction being brought into the same discussion with cognitive analytics. And look, whilst that might be the eventual outcome, I think it's a dangerous way to enter into the dialogue, right? If that is the primary driver to reduce headcount in the organization, I find that very often that's reflected in your metrics, it's reflected in the behaviors, and in turn it's reflected in poor adoption and resistance by practitioners naturally, right? You're creating that fear of job security, and, invariably I find practitioners sort of push back, and they'll spend their time sort of trying to justify why a tool won't work for them, right?
Yeah.
If you imply that a practitioner was ineffective prior to tool deployment, you will face that resistance. So I think to overcome this, as we've talked, you need, number one, the right metrics. But secondly, and very importantly, I think you need to provide practitioners with a roadmap on how to change and sharpen their skills in this changing environment, which actually touches on another one of those important pitfalls that I talked about, which is lack of education. If you can show practitioners how the change benefits them, not just the enterprise, right? And this sounds really basic, Philip, but it is so important, and if you can show them, I'm going to help you spend less time on those lower value, tedious, time-consuming tasks, allowing you to focus on the higher value activities, which, by the way, most professional practitioners that I know prefer to spend their time on, those higher value tasks, right? Negotiating with suppliers rather than crunching numbers. So that's the first thing. But the second thing really is, providing them education and training on this new data skill set. I think you very quickly, erode that resistance. They see a path for them within the enterprise, within the organization, but, they're also, I'm not saying you're inviting people to go outside of your organization, but you're giving them a marketable skill, which in turn removes, resistance and fear, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not, I'm not talking here about turning practitioners into data scientists, right? I'm talking about just arming them with knowledge about how they impact data, teaching them the art of the possible with regards to, how technology can help them and be more effective consumers of that data and insights.
So my last question for today, and I'm sure that there's no such thing here as a silver bullet, but there's certainly some actions that can produce a positive impact on the procurement leader's ability to drive the change that they need to increase this adoption of analytics and of cognitive solutions. I just wondered if you could share what you see as being those biggest actions or the most impactful actions that they can take.
Sure. I'd say certainly, having a dedicated project in which you specifically address change management as a deliberate effort rather than an afterthought is absolutely critical. Certainly, a positive impact comes from messaging, right? We've talked about metrics, we've talked about messaging and how that can help overcome fear, but it's more than overcoming fear. It's about building a desire to get involved, right, and an eagerness to adopt. So I think, leaders need to really portray a positive message as to why they want to implement these solutions and how they translate that into something valuable for the practitioner that, really resonates with the practitioners. And then lastly, and arguably, I would say one of the most important topics which we've not really touched on is the voice of the client. I think if you want adoption and you really want buy-in, from your practitioners, you must develop what the client and the practitioner needs. Have them work with you, co-creating these solutions and influencing the outcomes. So have them part of the squads that are developing these, and have your client as the product owner, I think will drive that, adoption and eagerness, to adopt and deploy these tools.
Thanks for listening to Day 4 of Conducting a Cognitive Symphony, sponsored by IBM. Head on over to Procurious.com for additional content on our blog and to contribute questions or comments via our discussion board. And you can also download Marco Romano's white paper, What Are the Success Factors in Cognitive and Analytic Strategies and Adoption, via ibm.com.